Welcome to your deep dive. Today we're putting on our detective hats.
Oh, I like this already.
Right. Getting ready to tackle the world of evaluating information.
One of my favorite things.
You send over a stack of sources, all about personal bias, spotting credible info online, the whole
I
shebang.
came ready to work. This is great.
So, are you ready to become an information detective?
Absolutely. Let's crack this case wide open.
I love it. Okay, so from the looks of it, you've been doing a lot of research on like personal bias in writing and evaluating online information, right? Like how to make sure we're not getting fooled.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how intertwined those two things really are, right? Because evaluating a source, it isn't just about, like you said, not getting fooled. It's not just about checking dates and names.
Right. There's more to it.
It's like, we need to understand the author's intent, any biases that they might have that could, kind of color how they present information.
Totally. It's like detective work, but for information.
Exactly.
So where do we even begin?
Well, one of the sources you sent was about this idea of lateral reading.
Oh, yeah, I read that one.
It turns out it's not enough to just, read something from top to bottom.
Right. Got to do more digging.
The Stanford study you sent, it found that, real fact checkers, right? The pros.
Yeah.
They don't just, stay on one page. They, open new tabs, do some digging around. They read laterally.
So it's like instead of just focusing on one source, we should be looking at what other sources say about the topic and the author, right? Like cross-referencing. It's like we're looking for clues.
Yeah, it's like corroborating alibis in our detective work, right? Like,
Yeah.
does this story hold up?
Okay, that's actually a really good analogy.
And that's how you can avoid being fooled by something that looks credible on the surface, but maybe has some hidden biases or agendas, kind of lurking beneath.
Right, like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Exactly.
Okay, so that makes sense, but it also sounds like a ton of work.
Right.
Are there any, shortcuts?
Well, you're in luck. You actually
Yeah.
sent over some resources about this as well.
Oh, perfect.
Websites like Wikipedia. I know everybody's like, Wikipedia. But it can be useful.
Right, to get you started.
Exactly. Snopes,
Yeah.
PolitiFact.
Those are good ones.
Those are your trusted informants, right? They can give you a quick sense of, are you dealing with a generally reliable source or one that's known for, spinning yarns,
Okay, that's helpful.
right?
So let's say we've used our informants, we've checked a source, it seems legit.
Okay.
What's next? Do we just dive into the information itself?
Yeah. And that's where things get even more interesting. Now we really need to analyze the scene of the information, so to speak.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
To do that, it's really important to understand what kind of source we're dealing with, right?
Oh, you mean is it a news article? A blog post? An academic journal?
Exactly, yeah. Popular, scholarly, professional. Each one kind of has its own style, its own neighborhood, you could say.
Hold on, back up a bit. Information neighborhoods. Tell me more about that.
Okay, so think of it this way, right? Like a gossip website.
Okay.
And the New York Times, they're in very different neighborhoods, right?
For sure.
They have different standards, different levels of fact-checking,
Right, totally different vibes.
Exactly.
That's actually a great way to put it. Information neighborhoods. Now I'm picturing like a map of the internet with all these different neighborhoods.
I love that. So
We've got to understand the neighborhood to kind of get a sense of what to expect, right? Like the level of scrutiny involved.
Exactly.
I'm following you.
And within those neighborhoods, authors have their own motives.
Right. Oh, this is where it gets juicy.
Right. Are they trying to, inform you objectively, persuade you to see things their way, sell you something?
Yeah.
Or just, entertain you with a good story?
Motive. Now we're really getting into the detective work here.
Right.
So how do we figure out what they're really trying to do with the information?
It's all about context, right?
Yeah.
Think about who the author is, what kind of publication it is, what audience they're targeting.
So all those clues can help us figure out their intent.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's like we're building a profile of our source, right?
Yeah.
Understanding their background, their usual haunts, their likely motives.
You got it.
I'm loving this detective work.
And once you kind of have a handle on that, you can start to separate the facts from the fiction, the hard evidence from, the cleverly disguised red herrings.
This is fascinating, but I have to be honest, I'm also feeling a little overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
We've gone from lateral reading to information neighborhoods to author profiles. How am I supposed to remember all of this?
Don't worry, it becomes second nature. Think of it like, you're building your detective toolkit, right?
Okay, I like that.
The more you use these tools, the sharper your instincts will become.
You're right. Practice makes perfect, or at least it makes us better detectives. Okay, I can feel my information detective senses tingling already, but we've got to keep going. Let's talk more about how to actually analyze the evidence, because we haven't even gotten to the nitty-gritty of the information itself.
You're right. We've laid the groundwork, but now we've got to equip you with the tools to analyze the evidence itself, to dissect it.
Let's do it.
You're right. We've laid out the groundwork, but now it's time to actually, like you said, analyze the information itself.
Right, because we've got to figure out if we're looking at hard evidence or just a clever fake.
It's like separating the facts from the fiction.
Yeah, exactly. How do we do that?
Well, it all comes down to this idea of objective versus subjective information.
Okay, I've heard those terms before, but remind me again, what's the difference?
So objective information, think of that as your hard evidence,
Okay.
the verifiable facts, right? Dates, numbers, concrete details.
Got it.
It's like if you're reporting on a baseball game, right?
Yeah.
You stick to the score, the hits, the errors.
No opinions allowed, just the facts.
Exactly. Now, subjective information, that's where things get a little fuzzier.
Okay, how so?
Well, that's where opinions, interpretations, judgments come in.
Oh, I see. So it's not necessarily wrong, it's just someone's perspective.
Right, exactly. It's like saying, oh, the red team, they played with more heart.
Right, which you can't really measure.
Exactly. It might be true to you, watching the game, but it's not like a verifiable fact.
That makes sense. So if objective information is our hard evidence, then we need to be able to spot when someone's trying to sneak in their own opinions, like they're planting false evidence at a crime scene.
Ooh, good analogy. And it happens more often than you might think.
Really? Give me an example.
Think about, product reviews online.
Oh, yeah, good one.
Right. Some reviews might stick to the objective facts, like this phone has a 12-megapixel camera and 256 gigabytes of storage.
Right, just the specs.
Exactly. But then other reviews might get subjective. They might say, this phone takes amazing photos and has tons of space. See the difference?
Yeah, one is verifiable, you can look up the specs. The other is how you feel about the photos or how much storage you think is enough.
Exactly. It's subtle, but it's important.
Okay, this is starting to feel kind of tricky. We're constantly bombarded with information, right? And it's not always easy to tell what's objective truth versus just someone's opinion dressed up in a fancy suit.
That's why it's so important to develop that, discerning eye.
Yeah, we need those detective skills.
Right. To be able to spot those subtle tells that give away someone's biases.
Wait, biases? Are you saying everyone's trying to pull the wool over our eyes?
No, not necessarily intentionally. But we all have biases, right? You and I included.
Okay, that's true. I guess I just always think of bias as a bad thing.
It can be, yeah, but it's also just a part of being human.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's like we each have our own unique set of fingerprints, right? But instead of fingerprints, it's our experiences, our beliefs, our upbringing. All of that shapes how we see the world.
So it's not just about spotting other people's biases, it's about being aware of our own as well.
Exactly. And that's honestly one of the trickiest parts of being an information detective.
How so?
Because we have to learn to recognize those biases in ourselves so that they don't cloud our judgment.
Yeah, I can see how that would be hard. It's like trying to see your own blind spots.
It really is. But luckily, you sent over some great information on different types of biases and how to recognize them.
Oh, good. Because I need all the help I can get.
So we've already touched on confirmation bias.
Right. That's when we only look for information that already confirms what we already believe.
Exactly. Like only reading news from sources that align with your political views.
Okay. Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of that one. What other kinds of biases should we be on the lookout for?
Well, there's cultural bias, where our own cultural background kind of colors how we perceive and interpret information from other cultures.
That makes a lot of sense. We each bring our own cultural lens to everything we see, even if we don't realize it.
Exactly. And then there's availability bias, which is a really interesting one.
Okay, what is that one?
It's our tendency to overestimate the likelihood of something happening based on how easily we can recall examples of it.
Can you give me an example? I'm not sure I totally get it.
Sure. Think about, plane crashes. They're actually incredibly rare.
Yes, statistically speaking.
Right.
Right.
But because they're so vivid and they're so widely reported, we tend to overestimate their frequency compared to, say, car accidents.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's so true.
Which are statistically much more common.
Right, but we don't hear about every single car accident on the news.
Exactly, so they don't stick in our minds as easily.
Wow, that's a perfect example. I can totally see how that kind of bias shapes our perceptions. So that's confirmation bias, cultural bias, availability bias. Are there any other usual suspects we need to watch out for?
Oh, plenty more where those came from. There's the halo effect, where like our overall positive impression of someone influences how we view their actions or opinions.
Oh, like blindly trusting a celebrity's endorsement just because we like them.
Exactly. Or the opposite, the horns effect.
Where we assume someone is untrustworthy because we don't like them.
Exactly. Once you start looking for these biases, you'll be amazed at how often they pop up.
Like they're everywhere.
They really are. But the important thing is to just be aware of them, to question our own assumptions and interpretations,
Right? Don't just take everything at face value.
and to actively seek out diverse perspectives, even those that might make us uncomfortable.
So it's about constantly challenging our own thinking, digging deeper, looking for evidence that both supports and challenges our views. It's like being both the detective and the suspect at the same time.
You got it.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about recognizing our own biases, but how do those biases affect the arguments people make? I know you sent over some information on that, something about fallacies.
Yes. Logical fallacies.
Yeah.
That was one of the most intriguing parts of my research for this deep dive.
Oh, tell me more. What did you find?
It was like uncovering this secret language of misleading arguments. It's like now I have names for all these like sneaky tactics people use in arguments.
Oh.
Slippery slope, ad hominem, hasty generalization. It's like a rogues gallery of misleading arguments.
It really is. And they can be surprisingly persuasive, especially like you were saying, when they tap into our existing biases or our fears. That's why it's so important to be able to like spot them in the wild.
Okay, so give me a crash course in fallacy spotting.
Okay.
Let's start with slippery slope. That one always trips me up.
Okay. So imagine someone saying, if we allow self-driving cars, the next thing you know, robots will be taking over the world.
Oh, I've heard that one.
Right. Classic slippery slope. They're taking a possible outcome and they blow it up into this like extreme unlikely consequence to try to scare people.
It's like, yeah, maybe self-driving cars will have some kinks to work out, but robots taking over, that's a bit of a stretch.
Exactly. It's about recognizing when someone's using fear instead of logic.
Okay, that's a good one to watch out for. What about ad hominem? It sounds like a villain's signature move.
It definitely can be. So an ad hominem attack is when, instead of actually addressing the argument itself, someone goes after the person making the argument.
So instead of debating the ideas, they just attack the person.
Exactly. Like, let's say someone's arguing for a higher minimum wage, and instead of engaging with the economic argument, someone says, well, you just say that because you're lazy and don't want to work hard.
That's not cool.
Right. It's completely irrelevant to the actual issue.
Okay, ad hominem. Check. Got it. What else?
Another common one you'll see is the hasty generalization. That's when someone jumps to a conclusion based on insufficient evidence or biased evidence.
Give me an example of that one.
Okay, so let's say you meet one person from a certain city and they're rude, and then you say, everyone from that city is rude.
Oh, right. Or like saying all teenagers are glued to their phones just because you saw like a group of teenagers on their phones at the mall or something.
Exactly. You're making a sweeping statement based on a very limited experience.
Okay, these fallacies are sneakier than I realized. But now that I know about them, I feel like I can spot them from a mile away.
That's the power of knowledge.
Yeah.
Once you learn to recognize these like patterns of misleading reasoning, you're much less likely to fall for them.
It's like having X-ray vision for bad arguments.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about biases, we've talked about fallacies. Anything else we need in our detective toolkit to make sure we're really evaluating information effectively?
Well, there's one more tool I think you'll find helpful. Remember those terms from your research? Ethos, pathos, and logos.
Oh, right, the three appeals. It's all about how people try to persuade us, right?
Exactly. So ethos, think of that as credibility. Does the source seem trustworthy? Do they seem knowledgeable? Like, are they an expert on the topic they're talking about?
Right, it makes sense.
Then there's pathos, which is all about appealing to emotions.
So trying to make you feel something instead of just appealing to your sense of logic.
Exactly. Think of like those commercials that show those heartbreaking images of sad animals to get you to donate to their cause.
Oh, yeah, those get me every time.
Right. They're using pathos to evoke a strong emotional response.
Sneaky, but effective.
Exactly. And then last but not least, there's logos, which is all about logic, using reasoning and evidence to build a strong case.
So ethos, pathos, logos. It's like a three-pronged approach to persuasion. And by understanding these approaches, we can be more aware of how they're being used to, like, sway our thinking, right?
Precisely. It's like having a decoder ring for persuasive language.
Hmm.
You start to see how those appeals are being used, sometimes for good, sometimes not so much, to try to shape how you see the world.
Wow, this whole deep dive has been eye-opening. We've gone from lateral reading to information neighborhoods to logical fallacies to the art of persuasion itself. That's a lot.
That's quite a journey, isn't it? But that's the thing about being an information detective. The case is never really closed.
You're right. There's always more to learn, more to question, and like new challenges will always pop up. But you know what? I actually feel a lot more equipped to handle those challenges now.
That's what we like to hear.
So, to everyone listening, remember, keep asking those questions, keep digging for the truth, and never stop being curious. Until next time, happy researching, everyone.